Billionaire slaps a black woman in a party for spilling champagne on his shoes. She does the unthinkable. Harrison Blake owned $12 billion, 6 companies, and half of Manhattan. What he didn't own was patience for clumsy waitresses who spilled champagne on Italian leather that cost more than most people's rent. So when the woman in the borrowed blazer looked him dead in the eye after ruining his night, he expected an apology. Maybe tears. Definitely groveling. He didn't expect her to pull out her phone, transfer $3,000, and calmly announce she'd just purchased his footwear. "Now they're mine," she said with a smile that made his chest tight. "And since they're my shoes, I can do whatever I want with them." In 38 years of getting everything he wanted, Harrison had never wanted anything as much as he wanted to understand the woman who'd just bought his dignity along with his shoes. Before we dive deep into the story, please let me know in the comment where you are watching from. Hit the subscribe button and get ready to enjoy the story. Tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you, and I do not want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. Harrison Blake adjusted his platinum cufflinks for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. His reflection multiplied endlessly in the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Manhattan penthouse. The city sprawled below him like a chessboard where he'd already won every game that mattered. At 38, he commanded a tech empire worth $12 billion. Yet tonight's charity gala felt more like a performance than philanthropy. His assistant had briefed him, smile for cameras, write the check, leave early. Another evening of calculated interactions with people who saw dollar signs when they looked at him. "Mr. Blake, your car is ready," his driver announced through the intercom. Harrison straightened his black tie ensemble, the Italian silk feeling foreign against skin that remembered when a good shirt came from a thrift store. Those memories belonged to another lifetime, before algorithms and acquisitions transformed him from the son of a Detroit factory worker into Manhattan royalty. Now people laughed at his jokes whether they were funny or not, and agreed with opinions he'd formed in boardrooms, not life. He'd learned to mistake deference for respect, transactions for relationships. The elevator descended 40 floors in silence. Through the glass walls, he watched the city lights blur past. Millions of lives he'd never touch, stories he'd never hear, problems money couldn't solve. But money solved everything that mattered to him now. It built walls as effectively as bridges, and Harrison preferred the walls. Naomi Williams pressed her uniform one final time, the hotel's navy blazer crisp despite being borrowed from a colleague 3 sizes larger. She'd been catering events at the plaza for 18 months. Long enough to know that tonight's crowd would barely register her existence unless something went wrong. That was fine by her. Invisible meant safe, and safe meant she could afford next semester's textbooks for her master's program in social work. At 29, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who'd learned to find strength in small victories. Tonight's victory would be surviving another evening of serving people who spent more on wine than she made in a month, all while maintaining the smile that had gotten her through worse things than this. "Naomi, you're on Champaign service for the VIP section," her supervisor instructed, handing her a silver tray. "These are the big donors. Extra care tonight." She nodded, checking her reflection in the service elevator's polished steel. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun, her makeup minimal but professional. She'd learned to make herself presentable without drawing attention, a skill that served her well in spaces where she didn't quite belong but needed to be. The ballroom doors opened to reveal a sea of tuxedos and evening gowns, crystal chandeliers casting everything in golden light. The air hummed with practiced laughter, and the kind of small talk that happened when everyone was performing for everyone else. Naomi had studied these people from the margins, their rituals, their codes, their casual indifference to the staff that made their elegance possible. She moved through the crowd with practiced grace, offering champagne with the warm but professional smile she'd perfected. Most guests took glasses without making eye contact, their conversations flowing around her as if she were part of the furniture. That was the arrangement, and she understood it perfectly. But as she navigated toward the VIP section, something twisted in her stomach. Not nervousness exactly, but the strange feeling that tonight would be different. That the careful distance she maintained between their world and hers was about to collapse in ways she couldn't imagine. The evening stretched ahead of her like a test she hadn't studied for, and Naomi Williams had no idea that across the room, Harrison Blake was about to discover that some encounters change everything. When you meet someone new, what shapes your first impression of them? Their appearance, their status, or something deeper? The collision happened in slow motion, like a dance choreographed by fate itself. Naomi had been moving through the VIP section with her usual careful precision, balancing the silver tray of champagne flutes while navigating between clusters of donors discussing tax breaks and yacht purchases. She'd served 3 tables without incident when she spotted him, the man every server had been warned about. Harrison Blake stood at the center of a small circle, his presence commanding attention even in a room full of Manhattan's elite. He was younger than she'd expected, with sharp features that suggested intelligence and dark eyes that seemed to calculate the worth of everything they surveyed. His black tuxedo was perfectly tailored, probably costing more than her entire year's tuition. But it was his posture that caught her attention. The way he held himself slightly apart even while surrounded by admirers, as if he were observing from behind bulletproof glass. "Mr. Blake," a woman in diamonds was saying, "your foundation's education initiative is simply revolutionary. The impact on underprivileged communities." "It's good business," Harrison interrupted, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from never being questioned. "Educated workers drive innovation. Innovation drives profit. Everything else is sentiment." The group laughed as if he'd made a brilliant joke rather than reduced human potential to a spreadsheet calculation. Naomi felt something tighten in her chest as she approached with her tray. She'd heard variations of this conversation before, wealthy people discussing poverty like it was an abstract concept rather than her childhood reality. She was 3 steps away when the woman in diamonds gestured expansively, her elbow catching the edge of Naomi's tray. Time fractured into crystalline moments. The silver tray tilting, champagne flutes sliding, golden liquid arcing through the air like liquid starlight. Naomi's hand shot out instinctively, trying to save what she could, but physics had already claimed victory. The champagne splashed across Harrison Blake's Italian leather shoes in a perfect cascade, droplets catching the chandelier light as they fell. The conversation died instantly, a circle of shocked silence expanding outward like ripples in a pond. Everyone stared, at the champagne, at Harrison's shoes, at Naomi frozen with the empty tray in her hands. "I'm so sorry," Naomi began, her training kicking in even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "I can. Do you have any idea what these cost?" Harrison's voice cut through her apology like winter wind. He looked down at his shoes, then up at her, his dark eyes cold with the kind of dismissal she'd seen too many times before. Not anger exactly, but something worse, complete indifference to her as a human being. "Sir, it was an accident. If you'll let me." "An accident." He repeated the word as if it were foreign. "These shoes cost more than you make in 6 months. But I suppose that's what happens when—" He paused, his gaze sweeping over her with clinical assessment. "When people work in places they don't belong." The silence stretched tighter, every person in the circle suddenly fascinated by their champagne glasses, or the floor, or anywhere that wasn't this moment. Naomi felt the familiar heat of shame creep up her neck, the same feeling she'd carried through scholarship interviews and financial aid offices, the constant reminder that her presence in certain spaces was conditional, precarious. But then something shifted inside her. Maybe it was the way he'd looked at her, not like a person who'd made a mistake, but like a problem to be solved. Maybe it was the memory of her grandmother's voice. "Baby, your worth isn't determined by what's in your bank account." Maybe it was simply that she was tired of being made to feel small in a world that already worked overtime to diminish her. Naomi set down the empty tray with deliberate care, her movements precise and unhurried. She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out her phone, her fingers steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The VIP section was completely silent now, the kind of silence that preceded either disaster or revelation. She opened her banking app, fingers flying across the screen with the confidence of someone who'd learned to be resourceful with very little. Her student loan refund had just come through, money meant for next semester's books and rent. She tapped through the menus until she reached the transfer function. "What are you doing?" Harrison asked, his voice losing some of its certainty. Naomi looked up at him, her brown eyes meeting his dark ones without flinching. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but carried the kind of strength that came from surviving things money couldn't fix. "I'm buying your shoes." She held up her phone screen, showing a transaction for $3,000. More than the shoes actually cost, but she'd researched luxury footwear during her break. "There. Purchased. Now they're mine." The circle of onlookers seemed to collectively hold their breath. Harrison stared at her phone, then at her face, something flickering behind his eyes that might have been surprise or confusion or the first crack in his certainty. Naomi stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of amber in his dark eyes, close enough to smell his expensive cologne mixing with the champagne still dripping from his shoes. "And since they're my shoes now," she said, her voice never wavering, "I can do whatever I want with them." Then she did the unthinkable. She smiled. The smile hung in the air between them like a challenge Harrison Blake had never encountered in a boardroom, at a negotiating table, or anywhere in his carefully constructed world. It wasn't apologetic or pleading or even defiant. It was something far more unsettling. It was knowing. "That's—" Harrison started, then stopped. Words, his most reliable tools, seemed inadequate for the first time in decades. The woman standing before him had just spent what was probably a significant portion of her savings to buy his shoes, transforming herself from servant to owner in a single transaction. The power dynamic he'd understood perfectly 60 seconds ago had shifted into something he couldn't categorize or control. "Impossible," finished the woman in diamonds, her voice pitched high with shock. "You can't just, that's not how." "Actually, it's exactly how commerce works," Naomi said, her tone conversational as she slipped her phone back into her blazer pocket. "I saw something I wanted, I paid for it, now it belongs to me." She looked back at Harrison, her eyes holding steady contact. "Basic capitalism, Mr. Blake. I assume you're familiar with the concept." The circle of onlookers tittered nervously, unsure whether to laugh at what might be a joke or gasp at what was definitely audacity. Harrison felt heat climbing his neck. Not embarrassment exactly, but something close to it. In his world, problems were solved with lawyers, contracts, and leverage. This woman had just solved a problem with $3,000 and turned him into a footnote in her transaction. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice regaining some of its authority. "You can't purchase someone's personal property without consent. There are laws." "Are there?" Naomi tilted her head slightly, the gesture somehow making her seem taller despite Harrison's 6-foot frame towering over her. "Because I was under the impression that in America, when someone damages property, the standard remedy is financial compensation. I just chose to be generous with my calculations." She was right, and Harrison hated that she was right. More than that, he hated that she'd outmaneuvered him using his own principles. She'd taken the language of business, the cold logic of transactions, and used it to transform what should have been her humiliation into his confusion. "You need to leave," Harrison said, falling back on the one power he understood. "Security can escort you out." "Why would I need an escort?" Naomi asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. "I haven't done anything wrong. I apologized for the accident, I compensated you for the damage, and now I'm simply admiring my new purchase." She glanced down at his feet with the satisfaction of someone examining a successful acquisition. "They really are beautiful shoes. Italian leather, if I had to guess? The craftsmanship is exquisite." The absurdity of the situation crashed over Harrison like a wave. He was standing in the VIP section of a charity gala, wearing shoes that apparently belonged to a woman who served champagne for a living, while she discussed Italian craftsmanship as if they were colleagues at Sotheby's. Nothing in his experience had prepared him for this moment. "You're insane," he said, but the words came out weaker than he'd intended. "Am I?" Naomi's smile widened slightly. "Or am I just playing the game by your rules, Mr. Blake?" The woman in diamonds touched Harrison's arm. "Perhaps we should." "No." Harrison shook off her hand, his eyes never leaving Naomi's face. There was something happening here that he didn't understand, something that felt important in a way that had nothing to do with shoes or champagne or social protocols. This woman had looked at him, really looked at him, and seen something that made her willing to spend money she probably couldn't afford just to make a point. What was the point? That he was cruel? Entitled? Disconnected from the reality most people lived in? He knew all of that already. But the way she'd smiled at him, the way she was still smiling at him, suggested something else entirely. Not judgment, but recognition? As if she'd seen something in his response that he hadn't recognized in himself. "This isn't over," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure what this was or why it needed to continue. "I should hope not," Naomi replied, her voice soft enough that only he could hear. "After all, you're still wearing my shoes." She turned to the rest of the circle, inclining her head with the grace of someone ending a pleasant conversation. "Ladies and gentlemen, enjoy the rest of your evening." As she walked away, her posture straight and unhurried, Harrison felt something crack inside his chest, not breaking, but opening, like ice beginning to thaw. The logical part of his mind screamed that he should let her go, forget this happened, return to the comfortable predictability of his world, where people played their assigned roles and money solved every problem. Instead, he found himself watching the way she moved through the crowd, noting how other servers nodded to her with respect, how she seemed to carry light with her even as she disappeared into the kitchen's service entrance. His shoes felt different now, not just wet with champagne, but weighted with the knowledge that they belonged to someone else. Someone who had seen him at his worst and responded with something that wasn't quite forgiveness, wasn't quite challenging, but was entirely unexpected. Harrison Blake had spent his adult life in control of every variable, every outcome, every relationship. But as the crowd slowly resumed their conversations and the evening continued around him, he realized that for the first time in decades, he had no idea what happened next. And somehow, that terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. Harrison had lasted exactly 12 minutes trying to return to normal conversation before excusing himself to the men's room. He needed space to think, to process what had just happened, to figure out how a woman who served champagne had managed to turn his entire worldview upside down in less than 5 minutes. He was splashing cold water on his face when the lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in a moment later, casting everything in an eerie red glow. Through the bathroom's marble walls, he could hear the distant sound of surprised voices from the ballroom, the kind of controlled panic that happened when wealthy people encountered unexpected inconvenience. Harrison pushed through the bathroom door and nearly collided with a hotel manager rushing past with a flashlight. "What's happening?" Harrison called out. "Power grid failure, sir," the manager replied without stopping. "Affects 6 blocks. Could be hours before it's restored." The ballroom had transformed into something from another century, lit only by the flicker of emergency exit signs and the glow from cell phone screens. Guests clustered in small groups. Their evening were looking somehow more formal and more fragile in the dim light. Staff moved efficiently through the space with battery-powered lanterns, their voices calm and professional as they guided guests toward the exits. "Ladies and gentlemen," the hotel manager's voice echoed through a battery-powered megaphone. "Due to the power outage, we're temporarily unable to operate the elevators. Our staff will escort you via the emergency stairwells, but we ask for your patience as this will take some time." Harrison felt a familiar surge of irritation. He had a conference call with Tokyo in 3 hours, emails to respond to, decisions that couldn't wait for Manhattan's aging power grid to cooperate. He pulled out his phone to call his driver, then remembered that without power, the parking garage's electronic gates wouldn't open. The building's security systems would be offline. He was effectively trapped. Mr. Blake, a hotel employee, approached with a lantern. Given the circumstances, we're setting up a temporary waiting area in the mezzanine lounge for our VIP guests. It should be more comfortable while we work through the evacuation. Harrison nodded, following the young man through darkened corridors that seemed to stretch longer than they had an hour ago. The mezzanine lounge was a small, elegant space normally used for private meetings, now lit by a dozen battery-powered lanterns that cast dancing shadows on the walls. Leather chairs had been arranged in a rough circle, and someone had managed to locate candles that filled the air with the scent of vanilla and amber. About 15 guests had gathered there. The major donors, Harrison assumed, the people whose donations were large enough to warrant special treatment even during power outages. He settled into a leather chair near the window, hoping the combination of darkness and distance would discourage conversation. That hope died when he saw her. Naomi Williams sat in the chair directly across from him, still wearing her server's uniform, but somehow looking perfectly at ease in the candlelit space. She was listening to an elderly woman describe her concerns about her medication schedule, nodding with the kind of focused attention that suggested she actually cared about the answer. "How did you?" Harrison started. "Staff are required to stay until all guests are safely evacuated," Naomi said without looking at him. "Union rules. And since the stairwells are crowded and you're all priority guests." She shrugged, finally meeting his eyes across the flickering light. "Here we are." The elderly woman, Harrison recognized her as Mrs. Patterson, whose husband had donated millions to various causes before his death, patted Naomi's hand gratefully. "Thank you, dear. You're very kind to listen to an old woman's worries." "It's not worrying, it's planning," Naomi replied gently. "You're being smart about your health. That's admirable." Harrison watched this interaction with growing confusion. The woman who had just publicly humiliated him was now providing comfort to a stranger with the kind of genuine warmth he couldn't remember experiencing in years. There was no calculation in her response, no agenda beyond simple human kindness. "The power should be restored within a few hours," another guest was saying. "Though I suppose it could be worse. At least we're not stuck in an elevator." "Actually," Naomi said, "this is kind of nice. When's the last time any of us just sat in silence without screens or distractions?" She was right, Harrison realized. His phone was already at 60% battery, and he'd instinctively started rationing its use. Without the constant stream of emails and notifications, the space felt different. Quieter. More human. "I can't remember the last time I sat still for more than 10 minutes, admitted a man Harrison recognized from several boards. "Even in meetings, I'm usually checking messages." "The Amish might be onto something," Mrs. Patterson said with a dry chuckle. "Though I do miss my heating pad." As the conversation drifted around the circle, Harrison found his attention repeatedly drawn to Naomi. She participated naturally in the discussion, but seemed equally comfortable with silence. When others spoke, she listened with complete attention. When she spoke, her words were thoughtful, without the performative quality that characterized most social interaction in his world. She was also, he was beginning to realize, still wearing his shoes. In the candlelight, he could make out the damp stains on the expensive leather, and every time she shifted position, he was reminded that this woman had purchased his property out of sheer principle. "You're staring," she said quietly during a lull in conversation. "You bought my shoes," he replied, equally quiet. "Yes, I did." She looked down at her feet, then back at him. "Having seller's remorse?" "I'm having something." Harrison leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice further. "Why did you do it?" For the first time since he'd met her, Naomi seemed to consider her words carefully. Around them, the other guests had broken into smaller conversations, creating pockets of intimacy in the larger space. "Because," she said finally, "you looked at me like I was nothing, and I needed you to understand that I'm not." The simple honesty of her answer hit him like a physical blow. No anger, no accusation, just a statement of fact that made him see the last hour from an entirely different perspective. They were trapped together in candlelight and silence, with nowhere to run from the truth hanging between them. The conversation around them had settled into the comfortable rhythm of people who'd accepted their situation. Mrs. Patterson was dozing lightly in her chair, and two men near the window were debating the merits of various investment strategies in voices that suggested they'd forgotten they were trapped rather than networking. Harrison found himself studying Naomi in the flickering candlelight. Without the harsh ballroom lighting, her features seemed softer, more complex. There were laugh lines around her eyes, but also something deeper, a wariness that spoke of experience with disappointment. "You're doing it again," she said without looking up from her phone, where she appeared to be typing a message. "Doing what?" "Staring. Like you're trying to solve a puzzle." Harrison shifted in his chair, the leather creaking softly. "Maybe I am. You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" She finished typing and set her phone aside, finally meeting his eyes. "Let me guess, angry? Bitter? Grateful for whatever crumbs of acknowledgement you might throw my way." The accuracy of her assessment stung. "I expected less." "Less what?" "Less intelligence. Less dignity. Less." He searched for the word. "Less presence." Naomi was quiet for a long moment, and Harrison worried he'd offended her further. But when she spoke, her voice held something that might have been sadness. "You know what's funny? 3 years ago, I would have been exactly what you expected. Angry, bitter, grateful for crumbs." She looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the fabric of her borrowed blazer. "I was working 2 jobs and still couldn't afford my daughter's asthma medication. Living in a studio apartment where the heat barely worked, choosing between groceries and textbooks. Your daughter, Zoe. She's 7 now, staying with my mother tonight." Naomi's expression softened completely, the professional mask dropping away. "Brilliant kid. Reads at a 5th grade level already, asks questions that make me think for hours. She wants to be a doctor." Something shifted in Harrison's chest, not pity, but recognition. "What changed?" 3 years ago, you said." Naomi smiled, but it was tinged with something that looked like pain. "I got angry at the right person." She was quiet again, and Harrison found himself leaning forward slightly, genuinely curious about her answer. "There was this social worker," Naomi continued. "Case manager for the assistance program. Ms. Henderson. She looked at me exactly the way you looked at me tonight, like I was a problem to be managed, a file to be processed. Like my struggles were evidence of my failures, rather than a system designed to keep people like me struggling." Harrison felt heat creep up his neck. The parallel was uncomfortably precise. "She denied my request for emergency assistance. Said I needed to prioritize better, when I couldn't afford both rent and Zoe's inhaler. When I tried to explain that I was working 50 hours a week while taking classes, she said maybe I wasn't cut out for higher education if I couldn't manage my finances. What did you do?" "I went home and cried for about an hour. Then I got mad. Really mad. The kind of mad that changes things." Naomi looked directly at him. "I researched everything, the assistance program policies, Ms. Henderson's supervisor, the department budget, the statistics on working mothers in graduate programs. I wrote a letter, 12 pages, single-spaced, with footnotes." Despite everything, Harrison found himself impressed. "Did it work?" "Better than I expected. Turns out Ms. Henderson had been denying requests at twice the rate of other case managers, and my letter landed on the desk of someone who cared about those statistics. She was reassigned within a month." "And you got the assistance?" "I got something better. The supervisor offered me a part-time position as a client advocate, helping other people navigate the system, making sure they didn't get the Ms. Henderson treatment." Naomi's smile turned genuine. "It paid better than both my other jobs combined, and the hours worked with my class schedule." Harrison was quiet, processing this information. The woman sitting across from him had taken a moment of humiliation and transformed it into systematic change, using intelligence and research as weapons against indifference. It was exactly what she'd done to him tonight, he realized, turned his dismissal into an opportunity to assert her worth. That's when you decided to buy graduate-level shoes? He asked, attempting lightness. Naomi laughed, the sound warm and unexpected in the candlelit space. That's when I decided that other people's inability to see my value didn't determine my worth. Ms. Henderson taught me that some people will try to make you feel small because it makes them feel big. But you don't have to accept their assessment. She looked down at the shoes again, then back at him. Tonight felt like Ms. Henderson all over again. Except this time, I had $3,000 and a point to make. Harrison absorbed this, feeling something uncomfortably like shame settling in his stomach. I'm not sure I like being compared to a bureaucrat who denied help to struggling mothers. Then don't be like her, Naomi said simply. The directness of her response caught him off guard. No sugarcoating, no attempt to soften the criticism. Just a clear statement of choice and consequence. It's not that simple, Harrison said, though even as he spoke, he wasn't sure he believed it. Isn't it? Naomi tilted her head. You chose to look at me like I was worthless tonight. You could choose to look at people differently tomorrow. Around them, the candlelight flickered, casting shifting shadows on the walls. Harrison realized that for the first time in years, someone was talking to him like he was a person rather than a position, challenging him, expecting better from him, treating him like someone capable of growth rather than someone to be managed or impressed. It was terrifying. It was also the most alive he'd felt in months. Have you ever had someone challenge you to see beyond your first impressions and discover something deeper about yourself? The power had been out for nearly 2 hours when Harrison found himself doing something he hadn't done in years, talking about his childhood. It started when Mrs. Patterson woke from her nap and began sharing stories about her late husband's rise from factory worker to philanthropist. The candlelit atmosphere seemed to invite confession, and gradually, the small group of strangers began revealing pieces of themselves they typically kept hidden behind designer clothes and charitable donations. My father worked at Ford for 37 years, Harrison heard himself saying, the words emerging before his careful internal editor could stop them. Same shift, same station every day. He used to come home with grease under his fingernails that no amount of scrubbing could remove. Naomi looked up from her phone, where she'd been texting updates to someone, her mother, Harrison assumed, checking on her daughter. Her expression was curious but not surprised, as if she'd already guessed that his wealth hadn't come from inheritance. He was proud of that work, Harrison continued, surprising himself with the admission. Proud that he was building something real, something that would last. I used to think he was settling, accepting less than he deserved. Now I wonder if he understood something about value that I've forgotten. What happened to him? Mrs. Patterson asked gently. Heart attack at 58. 3 months before the plant closed permanently. Harrison's voice caught slightly. 37 years of loyalty, and they couldn't even manage to keep the place running long enough for him to see retirement. The group was quiet, respecting the weight of the story. Harrison had never told anyone about the bitter irony of his father's death. How Thomas Blake had died believing in the system that Harrison would eventually master and manipulate. Is that why you started your company? Naomi asked. Her voice was soft, lacking any trace of judgment. I told myself it was about innovation, disruption, changing the world. Harrison laughed, but it sounded hollow in the intimate space. Really, I think I was just angry. Angry that loyalty meant nothing, that hard work didn't guarantee security, that good people like my father could be discarded when they were no longer profitable. So you decided to be the one with the power to discard people instead of being discarded, Naomi observed. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of logical progression that hit him like a physical blow. Harrison started to deny it, then stopped. Yes. I suppose that's exactly what I did. And how's that working out for you? She asked. Harrison looked around the candlelit room, at Mrs. Patterson's kind face, at the other guests who had slowly relaxed into genuine conversation as the night wore on. He thought about his empty penthouse, his carefully scheduled days, the parade of people who laughed at his jokes and agreed with his opinions not because they cared about him, but because they cared about his money. It's lonely, he admitted. Safer, but lonely. Naomi was watching him with those clear brown eyes, and Harrison had the uncomfortable sensation that she could see directly through all his carefully constructed defenses. Zoe asks me sometimes why I don't have a boyfriend, Naomi said suddenly. She's 7, so she thinks everyone should be paired up like animals on Noah's Ark. I keep telling her that I'm too busy, that we're doing fine on our own, that relationships are complicated. Are they? Complicated. Everything's complicated when you're afraid of being seen as not enough. Naomi's smile was self-deprecating. It's hard to let someone get close when you're convinced they'll eventually figure out that you're just a girl from East Cleveland who's pretending to belong in graduate school. Harrison felt something click into place. You're not pretending. No. Some days it feels like I am. Like I'm always one mistake away from someone realizing I don't actually belong in the spaces I've worked so hard to enter. Tonight, when you bought my shoes, you weren't pretending then. Naomi considered this. No. Tonight I was just tired. Tired of letting other people's limited imagination define what I'm capable of. I had limited imagination, Harrison said quietly. You did. But you're talking to me now like I'm a person instead of a problem, so maybe your imagination is expanding. The observation was generous in a way that Harrison didn't deserve, and he felt something warm unfurl in his chest. When was the last time someone had offered him the possibility of growth instead of simply accepting his flaws as permanent features? Can I ask you something? Harrison said. Shoot. Why did you smile? After you bought the shoes, you smiled at me. Not angry, not triumphant, just knowing. What did you know? Naomi was quiet for a long moment, her fingers absently adjusting the blazer that was still too large for her frame. Around them, the other conversations had grown softer, more intimate, as if the darkness had given everyone permission to be more honest than daylight typically allowed. I smiled because I recognized you, she said finally. Recognized me how? As someone who's afraid. The way you looked at me, the way you dismissed me, it wasn't really about me at all. It was about protecting yourself from something that scared you. Harrison felt his throat tighten. What could possibly scare me about you? The same thing that scared Ms. Henderson about me. The same thing that scares a lot of people when they meet someone they've written off who refuses to stay written off. Naomi leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle but certain. I reminded you that the stories you tell yourself about who deserves what aren't actually true. And if those stories aren't true, then maybe you're not as different from your father as you've convinced yourself you are. The words hit him with the force of revelation. Harrison sat back in his chair, feeling as if she'd just handed him a map to territory he'd been lost in for years without realizing it. That's why you smiled, he said, understanding Dawn. Because you knew I was going to figure that out eventually. I hoped you would, Naomi corrected. People are usually more interesting than their worst moments suggest. In the candlelight, surrounded by the quiet hum of genuine conversation, Harrison Blake felt something he hadn't experienced since his father's death. The possibility that he might be worthy of someone's hope. The lights came back on like a slap. Harsh fluorescent brightness flooded the mezzanine lounge, instantly destroying the intimate atmosphere that had built over the past 3 hours. The warm pool of candlelight became clinical space again, and the small group of people who had been sharing stories like old friends suddenly looked like what they actually were. Strangers in expensive clothes who had been temporarily inconvenienced. Harrison blinked against the sudden glare, watching as the transformation happened in real time. Mrs. Patterson was already reaching for her purse, the spell of confession broken. The 2 men near the window were pulling out their phones, immediately absorbed in the flood of messages that had been waiting for power to return. Ladies and gentlemen, a hotel manager announced from the doorway, the elevators are operational again. We sincerely apologize for the inconvenience and hope. But no one was listening to his prepared statement. The group was already dispersing, grateful to return to their familiar roles and comfortable distances. The strange intimacy of the blackout was being rapidly erased, as if it had never happened at all. Harrison felt the change like a physical loss. Across the room, Naomi was straightening her borrowed blazer, her expression shifting back into professional mode. The woman who had shared her fears and hopes was disappearing behind the mask of service industry politeness, and Harrison realized with growing panic that he was about to lose something he hadn't even known he was missing. "Naomi," he started, standing as she gathered her things. "I should get back to work," she said without meeting his eyes. "The cleanup crew will need help, and my supervisor." "Wait." Harrison moved toward her, aware that the other guests were watching with the kind of polite curiosity that suggested they were already filing this moment away as an amusing anecdote for future dinner parties. Can we talk? Privately." Something flickered across her face, uncertainty, maybe even hope, but before she could answer, Harrison's phone buzzed with the aggressive insistence of messages that had been queuing for hours. Without thinking, he glanced at the screen. 47 emails, 12 missed calls, 3 from his assistant marked urgent, deal falling apart. The real world crashed back over him like a wave. The Tokyo acquisition that had been 18 months in the making, the board meeting scheduled for tomorrow morning, the shareholders who were counting on his focus and leadership. While he'd been sitting in candlelight talking about his father, millions of dollars in value had been evaporating. "I have to," Harrison started, his fingers already moving across the phone screen. "Of course you do," Naomi said quietly. There was something in her tone that made him look up. Her expression was carefully neutral, but he could see the disappointment she was trying to hide. The same look, he realized with sick recognition, that she must have seen on countless faces when privileged people remembered that their real lives were more important than whatever momentary connection they'd felt with someone like her. "This is important," he said, hating how the words sounded even as he spoke them. "There are people depending on." "I understand," Naomi cut him off, her voice gentle but final. "You have responsibilities. Important ones." She was right, and they both knew it. But somehow her understanding made it worse, not better. She wasn't angry or demanding or making a scene. She was simply accepting, with the grace of someone who had learned not to expect more than people were capable of giving. "Mr. Blake." His assistant had appeared as if summoned, probably tracking his phone's GPS the moment the power returned. "We need to get you to the office immediately. The Yamamoto deal is—" "I know," Harrison snapped, then forced his voice to return to professional calm. "Give me 2 minutes." But when he looked back, Naomi was already walking away. Not storming off, not making a dramatic exit, just leaving with the quiet dignity of someone who knew when a conversation was over. "Naomi." Harrison called after her, but she either didn't hear or chose not to respond. He started to follow, but his assistant stepped into his path. "Sir, with respect, we have a helicopter waiting on the roof. The board is expecting your call in 20 minutes, and if we lose this deal—" Harrison looked toward the service entrance where Naomi had disappeared, then at his phone screen filled with urgent messages, then at his assistant's expectant face. The weight of obligation, of responsibility, of the carefully constructed life he'd built pressed down on him like a physical thing. This was who he was. This was what mattered. Not candlelit conversations with a woman who served champagne, but deals and boards and the machinery of wealth that employed thousands of people and generated millions in value. The moment in the lounge had been an aberration, a temporary suspension of reality brought on by darkness and unusual circumstances. "You're right," Harrison said, his voice returning to its familiar authority. "Let's go." But as he walked toward the elevator, past the spot where Naomi had stood just minutes before, Harrison felt something break inside his chest. Not dramatically, not with the sharp pain of sudden injury, but with the slow, inevitable crack of something that had been under too much pressure for too long. The elevator doors closed on the mezzanine lounge, still lit by the abandoned candles that no one had thought to blow out. In the harsh fluorescent light, they looked small and unnecessary, their warm glow overwhelmed by the return of electric normalcy. Harrison had made his choice. He'd chosen the life he understood over the possibility he'd glimpsed, chosen the familiar weight of obligation over the terrifying lightness of connection. It was a rational decision, the responsible decision, the decision that any reasonable person would have made. It was also, he realized as the elevator climbed toward the roof and the helicopter that would carry him back to his real life, the worst mistake he'd ever made. Harrison saved the Tokyo deal. 3 hours of conference calls, 2 revised contracts, and 1 very expensive concession later, the Yamamoto acquisition was back on track. His assistant had praised his focus, the board had expressed their relief, and the stock price had stabilized in after-hours trading. By any measure that mattered in his world, the evening had been salvaged. He sat alone in his office at 4 in the morning, Manhattan spread out below him like a circuit board, and felt absolutely nothing. The leather chair that had cost more than most people's cars felt uncomfortable. The view that architectural magazines had called breathtaking looked flat and colorless. Even the satisfaction of solving complex problems, the rush that had driven him for years, had evaporated into something that felt hollow and mechanical. Harrison's phone buzzed with another message from his assistant, probably following up on tomorrow's meetings, but he didn't look at it. Instead, he found himself staring at a photograph on his desk that he hadn't really seen in months. His father, Thomas Blake, standing next to a newly assembled truck on the Ford assembly line, grinning with the pride of someone who'd built something with his own hands. For years, Harrison had looked at that photo and seen everything he'd rejected. The acceptance of limited possibilities, the naive faith in systems that didn't reward loyalty, the dangerous vulnerability of depending on other people's decisions for your security. Tonight, he saw something different. He saw a man who had chosen connection over isolation, who had found meaning in the work itself rather than just its rewards, who had believed that building something good was worth the risk of losing it. "What would you think of me now, Dad?" Harrison asked the empty office. The question hung in the air, unanswered and uncomfortable. Thomas Blake had raised his son to be kind, to work hard, to treat people with dignity regardless of their station in life. Harrison had taken those lessons and inverted them, using kindness as a tool, work as a weapon, and dignity as a luxury only the powerful could afford to extend to others. His computer chimed with an email notification, and Harrison glanced at the screen automatically. It was a message from the hotel, thanking VIP guests for their patience during the power outage and offering complimentary services as an apology for the inconvenience. The inconvenience. As if 3 hours of genuine human connection was something to be apologized for. Harrison thought about Naomi's voice in the candlelight, the way she'd talked about her daughter's dreams and her own fears with such honesty. He thought about Mrs. Patterson sharing stories about her late husband, about the way the forced intimacy of the blackout had revealed the people behind the personas they all wore. Most of all, he thought about the look on Naomi's face when the lights came back on and he immediately reached for his phone. Not anger or surprise, but a kind of sad recognition, as if she'd been expecting him to prove that everything they'd shared was less important than his other obligations. She'd been right to expect it, but that didn't make it hurt less. Harrison pulled out his personal phone, not the business line that never stopped ringing, but the device he used for the few remaining aspects of his life that weren't about work. He scrolled through his contacts, looking for something, though he wasn't sure what. His address book was filled with business associates, board members, and service providers. People who knew Harrison Blake the billionaire, but had never met Thomas Blake's son. When had he become someone with no real friends? When had efficiency replaced intimacy? When had networking substituted for genuine relationship? He could call any of a dozen people who would answer immediately, but not one of them would care about why he was calling, only what he might want from them. The hotel's website was still open on his computer. On impulse, Harrison clicked through to the staff directory, then realized he didn't even know Naomi's last name. Williams, she'd mentioned it once, almost in passing. He searched through employment databases his company subscribed to, then caught himself. What was he doing? Planning to show up at her apartment like some kind of stalker? But he had to do something. The weight of his mistake was pressing down on him like a physical thing, making it hard to breathe. For the first time in years, Someone had seen past his wealth and status to the person underneath, and he'd chosen his familiar prison over the possibility of freedom. Harrison looked at his father's photograph again, then at the city spread out below him. $12 billion in assets, controlling interest in 6 companies, the power to influence markets and change lives with a single decision. All of it felt meaningless compared to the 3 hours when someone had looked at him and seen potential for growth instead of just profit margins. His phone rang, the business line, because it was never really silent. Harrison looked at the caller ID. His assistant, probably with updates on the morning meetings that would determine the next quarter's strategy. Important calls, urgent decisions, the machinery of wealth that never stopped turning. For 18 years, Harrison had answered every call, attended every meeting, made every decision that was expected of him. He'd built an empire on the foundation of never letting personal feelings interfere with business obligations. Tonight, for the first time since his father's death, Harrison Blake turned off his phone. Then he stood up, walked to the office door, and did something that would have shocked everyone who thought they knew him. He left the building, got in his car, and drove toward the possibility that it might not be too late to choose differently. The city was quiet at 4:30 in the morning, the streets empty except for delivery trucks and the occasional taxi. Harrison had no plan, no strategy, no clear idea of what he would say if he found her. He only knew that the person he'd been in that candlelit room was more real than the person who'd spent the last 3 hours saving deals and protecting profits. Some risks, he was finally beginning to understand, were worth taking, even if it meant losing everything he thought he'd wanted. Harrison found her at a 24-hour diner in Queens, sitting in a corner booth with textbooks spread across the table and a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold hours ago. She was still wearing the borrowed blazer from the hotel, but she'd changed into jeans and sneakers, his expensive shoes nowhere to be seen. Through the window, he watched her highlight passages in what looked like a social work textbook, her concentration complete despite the fluorescent lighting and the sounds of the early morning crowd. She looked tired but determined, and Harrison realized she'd probably come here straight from the hotel to study, making the most of the quiet hours before her daughter woke up. It took him 10 minutes to work up the courage to go inside. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and Naomi looked up from her books. Her expression cycled through surprise, wariness, and something that might have been hope before settling into careful neutrality. "Mr. Blake," she said, "this is unexpected." "Harrison," he corrected, sliding into the booth across from her without invitation. "And I know it's unexpected. I wasn't sure you'd want to see me." "I'm not sure either," Naomi admitted, closing her textbook but keeping her hands on it like a shield. "Shouldn't you be in some important meeting right now? Saving the world one merger at a time." The gentle sarcasm in her voice stung because it was accurate. "I turned off my phone. Revolutionary. Harrison deserved that, and he knew it. I saved the deal. The Tokyo acquisition. 18 months of work, hundreds of millions of dollars, thousands of jobs potentially affected by the outcome. Congratulations." Naomi's tone was polite but distant. "It felt like nothing," Harrison continued. "Sitting in my office afterward, looking at all the metrics that proved tonight was a success, I felt empty. Like I'd won a game I didn't remember agreeing to play." Naomi studied his face in the harsh diner lighting. "What do you want, Harrison?" The question was simple, but Harrison found himself struggling to answer. What did he want? He'd spent so many years focused on what he thought he should want, success, security, control, that he'd lost track of what actually mattered to him. "I want to apologize," he said finally. "When the lights came back on, I became exactly the person you expected me to become. The person who sees other people as interruptions to more important business. You don't need to apologize for having responsibilities." "No, but I need to apologize for using them as an excuse to run away from something real." Harrison leaned forward slightly. "What happened tonight, in that room, that was the first genuine conversation I've had in years, maybe decades. And instead of recognizing that, instead of fighting for it, I let it slip away because it was easier to go back to what I knew. Naomi was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the cover of her textbook. Around them, the diner hummed with the quiet activity of people starting early shifts, grabbing coffee before long commutes, living the kind of ordinary lives that Harrison had forgotten existed. "You know what I was thinking about when I saw you walk in here?" Naomi asked. "My daughter, Zoe. She's 7, and she still believes that people are basically good, that if you treat someone with kindness, they'll treat you with kindness back. Every time someone proves her wrong, I watch a little bit of that faith die." Harrison felt something twist in his chest. "I don't want to be someone who kills a child's faith in goodness." "Then don't be." Naomi's voice was soft but firm. "You have a choice, Harrison. Every interaction, every decision, every moment when you could choose to see people as worthy of respect or as obstacles to overcome. You get to decide over and over again what kind of person you want to be. What if I've forgotten how to be anything other than what I am? Then you learn again." Naomi smiled, and Harrison felt something unlock in his chest. "You think I was born knowing how to stand up for myself? I spent most of my 20s apologizing for taking up space, for needing things, for having opinions. I had to learn that my voice mattered, that my worth wasn't determined by other people's approval." "How?" "Practice. Lots of practice. And people who believed I was capable of growth, even when I didn't believe it myself." She paused. "People who saw possibility in me instead of just problems." Harrison thought about the way she'd smiled at him in the ballroom after she'd bought his shoes. The knowing quality of that expression, the sense that she'd seen something in him that he hadn't recognized in himself. "You saw the possibility in me tonight," he said. "I did. I do." Naomi hesitated, then reached across the table to touch his hand. "The question is whether you're brave enough to see it in yourself." Her fingers were warm against his skin, and Harrison felt the same spark of connection they'd shared in the candlelight. But this time, instead of running from it, he turned his hand over and gently took hers. "I bought a diner," he said suddenly. "What?" 3 months ago. Not this one, but one like it in Detroit, near where my father used to work. It was going out of business, and I bought it through one of my holding companies. I told myself it was a real estate investment, but really—" Harrison paused, recognizing the truth as he spoke it. "Really, I think I was trying to buy back something I'd lost. Some connection to the person I used to be before I became so afraid of being vulnerable." Naomi's expression softened. "What did you do with it?" "Nothing yet. It's been sitting empty while I figured out what I actually wanted." Harrison looked at their joined hands, then back at her face. "I want to turn it into something good. A place where people can come for affordable meals, where kids can do homework after school, where the staff makes enough money to support their families without needing second jobs." "That sounds like a place your father would have liked." "It does." Harrison smiled, feeling lighter than he had in years. "Would you help me? I have no idea how to run a diner, but I know how to delegate. And you know how to see people for who they really are, not just what they can do for you." Naomi was quiet for so long that Harrison began to worry he'd overstepped, assumed too much based on a few hours of connection. But when she spoke, her voice was warm with possibility. "My daughter wants to be a doctor," she said. "But she also wants to help people who can't afford doctors. Maybe she'd like to meet someone who's trying to build something that makes the world a little more fair." "I'd like that," Harrison said. "I'd like that very much." Outside the diner window, the sun was beginning to rise over Queens, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Harrison Blake sat in a vinyl booth, holding hands with a woman who had challenged him to become better than he was, and felt something he hadn't experienced since his father's death. The possibility that he might actually deserve happiness. "One more thing," Naomi said, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "What's that?" "You're buying breakfast." "I spent my textbook money on some very expensive shoes last night." Harrison laughed, really laughed, for the first time in months. "Deal. But I want those shoes back eventually." "We'll see," Naomi said, her smile bright with promise. They might be the most valuable thing I've ever owned. As the morning light filled the diner, Harrison realized she was absolutely right. What does it take to choose vulnerability over safety, and how might that choice transform not just your own life, but the lives of everyone around you?